Hi, I'm Emily, and with me is Pastor Zach. This week, your sermon covered Genesis 50. Joseph dies at the age of 110. Is there any significance to that age?
Few things that are at least noteworthy about that age, and we shouldn't read too much into these things, but they are at least interesting. Number one is that 110 years old is widely recognized in extant Egyptian literature as the ideal age of a long life. In Egyptian culture, the fact that Joseph, who is of course essentially the prime minister of Egypt, dies at 110 years age, signifies God's divine blessing on his life. That's how the Egyptians would have looked at the time of his passing. In addition, it's also interesting that a later figure, one who is going to take from Moses the bones of Joseph to bring the bones of Joseph into the promised land as Joseph instructs his family right before he dies, is Joshua, who's going to lead the people of Israel over the River Jordan into the land of Canaan and begin the conquest. Joshua dies at 110 years old. So there's an interesting correspondence between the life of Joseph and the life of Joshua. It's also interesting when you, of course, compare the life of Joseph in terms of the length of his years to the lives of the patriarchs that immediately precede him. Of course, Joseph's father, Jacob, laments that his life hasn't attained the same longevity as the life of his forefathers, but Jacob died at 147 years old, so Joseph doesn't even make it to the age of his father, Jacob, who has lived less long than Isaac, and successively so on. And this is this kind of corresponding pattern that we've seen emerge since the flood of the shortening or the decreasing life expectancy of people living in the time after the flood. Of course, prior to the flood, we'll recall that people were living 5, 6, 7, 8, even 900 years. That was a regular occurrence. And yet after the flood, there's this really sharp decreasing average life expectancy even for the patriarchs. One final, maybe interesting point to consider is that when we add up the years of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's life, Abraham lives to be 175 years old. So if we were to break down how Abraham's age works, 175, that's 7 times 5 squared. And then Isaac lives to be 180 years old, which is 5 times 6 squared. And then we have Jacob lives to be 147 years old, and that's 3 times 7 squared. So you have 7 times 5 squared, 5 times 6 squared, 3 times 7 squared. So you've got the first number going 7, 5, 3, odd numbers decreasing. And then on the inverse, you've got 5 squared, 6 squared, 7 squared. So this number on the other side going, the squared number going up by 1 each time. Well, Joseph, if we were to put together the span of his life, it would be 1 times 5 squared plus 6 squared plus 7 squared. So in some kind of interesting fashion, at the very least, we could say that Joseph's life is essentially fulfilling that pattern of 7, 5, 3 down to the 1, and he's also the sum of his predecessors, 5 squared, 6 squared, 7 squared. And rather than this being some kind of weird numerology thing, I think what instead perhaps Moses is highlighting in the structure of this genealogy, or of the lives of the patriarchs and the genealogical records that he includes throughout the book of Genesis, and particularly why he records their ages, is that we see in Joseph kind of this summation of the end of the patriarchal period, that Moses is drawing a ribbon around it, and some of these patterns demonstrate to us as readers that we should see in Joseph kind of the culmination and the end of this period of biblical history. So those are at least some interesting things to note about Joseph's age that are unique to the years 110, the days of his life.
Wasn't embalming traditionally a religious practice in Egypt? Is the fact that Joseph was embalmed a warning that the family was assimilating into the religious life in Egypt?
Yeah, it is fascinating in that the practice of embalming in Egypt was not merely a funeral practice. It wasn't simply the way that things were done before you interned a body. Rather, it did have significant cultish undertones about their understanding of the afterlife and of the worship of the gods, etc. So there was a definite religious undercurrent in the majority practice of embalming in Egypt. But I think we're given a satisfying hint in chapter 50 that is not the way in which the embalming of Jacob and Joseph is being done. Because in fact, we have two records of embalming in chapter 50. Jacob is embalmed and Joseph is embalmed. So both of them are in fact embalmed. But there in verse 2 of chapter 50, we read, "And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father." Now that's interesting because in most cases that we read about embalming in Egyptian literature, it's not the physicians who do embalming, it's the priests because of its religious overtones. So the fact here that it's explicitly referenced that it is not the priests, but rather the physicians who are doing the embalming suggests that the embalming of Jacob is not connected to the religious worship of the Egyptians, but it is rather simply, in Joseph's case, a way of trying to preserve the body of Jacob. And you can understand why Joseph's interested in doing this. He's about to take his father's body on a long funeral procession all the way through the wilderness, around the Dead Sea, crossing the Jordan River into the land of Canaan. This is going to take some time. And so, in order to preserve this body for this journey before he is actually committed to the ground in the same cave in which his forefathers have been buried, there's some work that needs to be done to try to keep this body somewhat preserved for that process, and so embalming makes sense. The reason why physicians would be involved in this case is that the practice of embalming essentially involved the cutting open of the body and removing the essential organs that would basically expedite the decay of the body, the organs that were likely to decay fastest and lead to the overall decay of the body, and replacing those with some kind of paper or tissue or something like that that would just kind of fill the cadaver at that point. And that was the way in which embalming was done. Often then there was a great deal of religious service that was connected to that, but it seems as though just the physical element of the embalming was done, which is why only reference to physicians are made.
In your sermon, you stated that the military escort sent with Joseph is a kind of honor guard. But is it possible that Pharaoh was afraid that Joseph and his family would not return to Egypt if he let them go, and that the horses and chariots were just there to ensure that he would return?
I read a few commentators who offered that suggestion that perhaps it is too charitable to read this chapter as though Pharaoh is being kind to the family of Israel. Perhaps he's trying to make sure that this man of God is not leaving Egypt for good, that he has become reliant on Joseph's wise administration and ability to interpret dreams. And so he wants to make sure that Joseph doesn't get any ideas about staying in Canaan. And so he sends this military guard to basically not only take Joseph there, but to, if necessary, forcibly bring Joseph back. I find that to be a very unpersuasive view of the text for a couple of important reasons. Number one, if we note there um, down at verse 7, so Joseph went up to bury his father. With him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. So you would have to, in order to think that Pharaoh is trying to forcibly ensure that Joseph returns, you would have to believe that Pharaoh is operating under the assumption that Joseph and Joseph's brothers would be willing to leave behind their children in Egypt, all of their possessions, all of their wealth, all of their flocks, in order to settle down in a foreign land. That just doesn't seem plausible. Clearly, if the Israelites were planning on leaving, if Joseph had any idea of staying in the land of Canaan, or if Pharaoh was under any fear that that might develop in Joseph's mind, they would be taking their children with them. They're not going to leave their children behind. More than that, I think what's clearly being done by Moses, because we have to remember Moses is the one who's narrating this account, and he's doing so in a way that is factually recording the events of history, but he's also fronting and structuring elements of this history in a way that is evocatively calling to mind for his first readers, the Israelites who have just left Egypt, elements of their past as a nation that are going to recall to mind for the present day Israelites their immediate present, what they've just experienced, and also the future that they're about to be entering into the land of Canaan. And so there's this clear contrast I think Moses is drawing for those readers between Joseph and his relationship with the Pharaoh of his day, and Moses and the relationship with the Pharaoh of the present day Israelites, which was, of course, almost the complete opposite. It's an antithetical relationship. And Moses, in fact, sets that contrast off very explicitly at the very beginning of the book of Exodus, where in the early parts of the first chapter, the orienting line that tells you that things are different now in Egypt is, "And there arose a Pharaoh in Egypt who did not remember Joseph." So the first Pharaoh is one who deals kindly with Israel because he thinks well of Joseph. The later Pharaoh is a Pharaoh who deals harshly with the Israelites because he has no memory or understanding of Joseph or what these people have meant to Egyptian history. So we lose that contrast if we don't see in this chapter the kind disposition of Pharaoh to the people of Israel.
Did Jacob actually tell Joseph to forgive his brothers like the brothers claim in verses 16 and 17?
It certainly is a very convenient message that the brothers just all of a sudden remember of, "Hey, by the way, I don't know if dad ever told you this, but the last thing that he told us was he really wanted you to forgive us and there not be any more bad blood between us." I find, of course, we're not told exactly whether or not that actually occurred. We don't have any account of Jacob saying this to his sons, nor does Moses give us any kind of editorial comment, such as the brothers were lying through their teeth to their brother in order to get him to forgive them. We're not given any kind of additional details. However, I find it a little bit hard to believe when we put all of the factors that we have together. Number one, Joseph has just had a prolonged private audience with his father immediately before Jacob dies. Joseph comes with his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. He has a moment with his father where his father spends some time recalling the history of the past, what God has done in bringing him to this place, and then Jacob blesses Joseph's oldest two sons. He adopts them, and then Joseph is also told by his father Jacob, "When you go back to the land of promise, I've reserved a part of a mountain for you and for your descendants. That will be yours." So there's memories of the past. There's adoption and blessings for the son present. There's foretelling of the future to come. And yet, in all of that, it would seem to have slipped Jacob's mind, if indeed he does have this final burden to make sure that Joseph is in right relationship with his brothers, to actually tell that to Joseph. And then the next chapter is Jacob blessing all of his sons and foretelling for them what will be the future of the tribe that bears each one of their names. And once again, that would seem to be the perfect opportunity. All of his boys are gathered there for him to look at all of his sons and say, "And the last thing that I want before I die is for you all to be at peace with one another. I want to know that the minute that my eyes close in death, that the knives don't come out and you guys don't start tearing each other to pieces. Promise me before I die that will happen." In fact, we know that Jacob is in the habit of getting these kind of last promises out of his sons because that's what he does with Joseph. He makes Joseph promise him to take his bones back to Canaan. So with all of that, it seems conspicuously absent in these final chapters that Jacob doesn't actually communicate anything like what the sons of Jacob says that had said to Joseph. And also, I think maybe we have a little bit of a riff on the fact that the brothers have all throughout this history styled themselves as "we are honest men," when they're not really being honest to their father about what they've done with Joseph. And even when they say to Joseph, who they don't yet know is Joseph, when they first come to Egypt, "We are honest men," they're not really even being forthright about this other brother that they keep referencing, that something bad has befallen to him and he is no more. Well, of course, they're speaking to that brother and he knows exactly what happened. And so they're not as honest as they claim to be. So while these men, we've seen gradual transformation in their lives, and most particularly, we've seen tremendous transformation in the life of Judah, it would seem perhaps that they're still not quite above stretching the truth. And also, they're living in great fear. They're in terror. And so terror is making them perhaps be a little bit less than truthful, even at the end of Genesis.
Why does Joseph not explicitly forgive his brothers?
I think the clear reading of this text is not that Joseph does not forgive his brothers, but that he has already forgiven them. In essence, he's sort of rejecting the premise of their plea altogether. Uh, he already has told them when he first revealed himself to them that they didn't have any need of being afraid, that he knew, that he had come to understand at least, that while they had done a great evil against him, that God had so ordained the events of his life to bring him to this place in order to save not only Egypt, but he told them at the time to preserve a remnant for you, to keep your little ones alive. And then here at the end of the book of Genesis, he repeats that same idea. You intended it for evil, but God intended it for good, and therefore I will take care of you and your little ones. And so in some respects, Joseph is treating this as water under the bridge, that he's already forgiven them. There's no need of renewing his forgiveness. In a true understanding of forgiveness, he's already put their sin in its place. He's already reconciled with them. And so while they are terrified that perhaps that Joseph will now spring upon them, it really says more about the brothers than it says about Joseph. For Joseph, for his part, forgiveness is already a matter of the past. He handled that business more than 17 years ago. His eyes are on the future.
So you finished preaching through Genesis. What's next? Do you plan to continue the podcast?
We continue to plan to continue the podcast, whatever the mess that was. We're taking the month of December off. I obviously need a break from the podcast after the beginning of this last answer. So we're going to be in a Christmas series for the month of December after the first week. Pastor Doug's going to be preaching here an unrelated to Christmas sermon in the first Sunday of December. Then Wes and Kelly will be preaching 2 sermons to kind of lead us through the first couple weeks of Advent. Although we're moving away from the Advent theme, we're going to be doing a sermon series on responses to the coming of Christ. Now I'll preach the final sermon in that series on December 22nd, the Sunday immediately before Christmas. Then we'll have another Sunday, the Sunday between Christmas and New Year, where we'll be in a wisdom literature text. We did this last year when I was in Proverbs 7, looking forward to a new year. What practical principles of wisdom can we learn as we consider kind of resolutions for living? We're going to do something similar out of a different text in Proverbs. And then we're going to begin in January a new sermon series. And when we launch that sermon series, we will start a new season of the podcast. So we're taking a little break, but more to come when we launch into our new sermon series in the year ahead.
If you have any questions from the sermon or the sermon passage that you would like to have answered on the podcast, please email them by 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning to questions@westcannon.org. We'll see you next week.